Breaking. What just happened inside Parliament has pushed Britain to the edge of a full political collapse. Nigel Farage didn't just challenge the Prime Minister today, he detonated a political bomb so powerful that MPs fled the chamber, markets panicked, and senior figures began preparing for the end of this government. This wasn't theatre, this wasn't rhetoric. This was an exposure that may have changed British politics forever. It began without warning. No shouting, no chaos. Just Nigel Farage standing slowly at the dispatch box, holding a thin folder that immediately caught the attention of the entire chamber. The room fell quiet before he even spoke. MPS sensed something was coming, but no one was prepared for what followed. Prime Minister, Farage began, his voice calm and deliberate. I am in possession of evidence that you personally intervened in migration enforcement decisions for political gain. That single sentence sucked the air out of the room. Keir Starmer froze. His posture stiffened. His eyes flicked sideways, not toward Farage, but toward his own front bench. That was the first sign of panic. Farage didn't rush. He never does when he knows he's winning. He explained that for months, information had been quietly passed to him by individuals inside government departments. Not activists, not politicians, but long-serving civil servants. People who had worked under multiple prime ministers. People who said they could no longer stay silent. Then he opened the folder. The first document was dated and stamped, an internal memo from the Home Office. Farage read it slowly so there could be no misunderstanding. It showed direct intervention from the Prime Minister's office to halt multiple deportation operations already approved and funded, flights cancelled at the last minute, logistics abandoned, millions of pounds wasted. Starmer tried to interrupt. The Speaker attempted to restore order. It didn't matter. Farage pressed on, pointing directly at the government front bench. These decisions, he said, were not taken by officials. They were not taken by courts. They were taken by you. Murmurs turned into shouting. Several Labour MPs stood up at once. One walked out, then another, then another. The benches began to thin. In real time, cameras caught faces buried in hands. Others stared straight ahead, expressionless, as if watching a disaster they could no longer stop. Farage then revealed what transformed the moment from damaging to catastrophic. He quoted directly from private messages, communications between the Prime Minister and senior figures discussing how deportations would look politically, how enforcement would upset key voter groups, how timing mattered more than law. As the words echoed through the chamber, the reaction was instant. Gasps, shouts. Someone yelled "shame" from the back benches. The Prime Minister finally spoke, his voice strained, insisting the words were taken out of context. But Farage didn't argue. He didn't need to. He simply held up the page again and repeated, "These are your words." That was when the chamber lost control. The Speaker called for order again and again. MPS ignored him. 17 cabinet ministers were later confirmed to have left the chamber entirely, not to protest, but to distance themselves. To escape the cameras, to survive. Farage wasn't finished. He revealed that the cancelled deportations involved hundreds of individuals already processed and approved for removal. Some with criminal records, some with violent convictions. Each statistic landed harder than the last. The noise in the chamber grew unbearable. At that moment, the mood shifted from anger to fear, because everyone inside that room understood the same thing at the same time. This wasn't just embarrassing. This wasn't just political damage. This was evidence, and evidence has consequences. As Farage closed the folder and paused, the silence returned, heavier than before. He looked across the chamber and delivered the line that would dominate headlines within minutes. This government, he said, has not merely failed. It has deliberately acted against the interests of the British people. By the time he stepped back from the dispatch box, the damage was already irreversible. MPS were on their phones, journalists were running for the exits, and somewhere inside Westminster, senior figures were quietly asking the same question. As the chamber struggled to regain order, Farage made it clear that what he had revealed so far was only the surface. The real damage, he warned, lay in what the public had not yet seen. And then, with deliberate precision, he continued. He explained that the documents were not isolated incidents or administrative errors. They formed a pattern, a sustained, deliberate strategy driven not by law, more security or national interest, but by political calculation. According to the evidence laid before Parliament, deportation enforcement was repeatedly delayed, paused, or quietly abandoned whenever polling data suggested it might upset key voter blocks. This wasn't incompetence, this was intent. Farage described how senior officials inside the system had watched in disbelief as lawful removals were stopped at the final hour, flights cancelled after crews were booked. Security teams stood down without explanation. Contracts torn up, millions of pounds written off without parliamentary scrutiny. When questioned internally, officials were allegedly told the same thing again and again. This comes from the top. Those words rippled through the chamber like a warning siren. He then detailed how frustration inside the civil service had turned into alarm. Experienced staff, some with decades of service, began documenting what they were seeing. Emails saved, messages copied, memos archived. Not for politics, Farage insisted, but for protection. Protection against being blamed later when the truth eventually surfaced. And now, he said, that moment had arrived. The most explosive part came next. Farage revealed that beyond the cancelled deportations, there were internal discussions about suppressing migration data entirely. Figures delayed, reports reworded, statistics withheld until a more convenient time. The implication was devastating. Parliament, the press and the public were not just being misled, they were being deliberately kept in the dark. When Farage quoted a conversation referencing the need to manage perception rather than reality, the reaction was visceral. MPs shouted across the floor. Several Labour members demanded the remarks be withdrawn. The Speaker intervened again, warning Farage about parliamentary language. Farage acknowledged the warning, then continued anyway, adjusting his wording just enough to remain technically within the rules. The meaning, however, was unmistakable. He explained that migration numbers had reached levels far higher than publicly acknowledged, and that internal estimates showed the situation worsening rapidly. Yet instead of transparency, the response was secrecy. Instead of honesty, narrative control. Farage accused the government of treating voters not as citizens, but as obstacles to be managed. As he spoke, the visual contrast inside the chamber became impossible to ignore. Opposition benches were alert, focused, leaning forward. Government benches looked hollowed out. Empty seats multiplied as MPs slipped away quietly. Some avoided eye contact with the cameras. Others stared at the floor. A few openly argued with colleagues, their microphones still live. Then came the moment that pushed the situation into outright crisis. Farage announced that he was in possession of an audio recording. Not hearsay, not anonymous claims, a recording. He described it as a private discussion involving senior figures, focused on delaying the release of migration data until after politically sensitive moments. The Speaker immediately objected, citing parliamentary rules. Farage stopped short of playing it in full, but he summarised its contents carefully, line by line, ensuring every MP understood exactly what was being alleged. The effect was electric. Journalists in the gallery could be seen typing furiously. Phones across the chamber lit up as MPs received messages from aides, party officials and nervous donors. Within minutes, news alerts were flashing across the country. Government accused of suppressing migration data. Parliament descends into chaos. Prime Minister under intense pressure. Outside Westminster, the reaction was just as swift. Markets began to slide. Currency traders responded to the uncertainty. Social media exploded with clips, quotes and speculation. The story was no longer contained within Parliament. It was everywhere. Back inside the chamber, Farage delivered his most chilling warning yet. He said that if the evidence was authenticated, and he was confident it would be, the implications went far beyond politics. He spoke of potential breaches of ministerial duty, of obstruction, of decisions taken that may have crossed from political judgment into legal risk. At that point, the Speaker finally forced an end to the exchange. The session was suspended. MPs poured out into the corridors, not talking to journalists, not issuing statements, but whispering urgently to one another. Emergency meetings were called on the spot. Party whips scrambled to account for missing members. Phones rang non-stop. Behind closed doors, the mood was no longer defiant. It was defensive. Senior figures reportedly asked the same questions again and again. Who knew? Who signed off? What else exists? And perhaps most importantly, but what happens next? Because by the time Parliament paused, one truth was already clear. The government had not just suffered a bad day, it had suffered a credibility rupture, and once trust breaks at that level, it rarely heals. While chaos consumed Westminster, the shockwaves spread rapidly beyond Parliament and into the country itself. Within minutes of the session being suspended, the story dominated every major platform. News channels broke from regular programming. Radio phone-ins were overwhelmed. Social media timelines moved faster than anyone could follow. This wasn't just another political scandal. To millions watching from their homes, it felt like a line had finally been crossed. Financial markets reacted first. The pound dipped sharply as traders priced in instability. Analysts warned that prolonged uncertainty at the top of government could trigger capital flight. Investment firms issued urgent notes to clients describing the situation as volatile and unpredictable. The message was clear, and markets fear political paralysis, and Britain was suddenly staring straight at it. But the deeper reaction came from the public. Across the country, anger built hour by hour. Veterans groups, already frustrated by years of neglect, spoke openly about betrayal. Online forums filled with stories of former service members struggling to survive while government resources were poured elsewhere. Charities reported spikes in calls. People weren't debating policy anymore. They were questioning priorities, values, and honesty. By mid-afternoon, crowds began gathering outside Westminster. At first, small groups, then hundreds, then thousands. Chants echoed down Whitehall. Police barriers were reinforced as the atmosphere hardened. Similar scenes unfolded in other cities: Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool. Protests formed spontaneously, driven by a sense that something fundamental had gone wrong. Inside political parties, the mood turned brutal. Labour MPs who had defended the leadership for years suddenly fell silent. Some released carefully worded statements expressing concern. Others said nothing at all. A growing number privately admitted they were considering their positions. Whips struggled to maintain discipline as loyalty fractured under pressure. One MP was overheard saying, "This isn't survivable." No, not after the... Factional lines hardened fast. MPs from marginal seats panicked, aware that public trust in their areas was evaporating by the minute. Red Wall constituencies, already fragile, were described by insiders as on fire. Messages leaked from internal groups showed MPs urging leadership to act immediately. No, not tomorrow, not next week, but now. Meanwhile, Downing Street descended into near paralysis. Emergency meetings were called and then delayed. Advisors argued over messaging while the situation moved faster than they could respond. Draft statements were rewritten again and again, each version softer than the last. No one wanted their name attached to anything that might age badly within hours. Ministers arrived and left through side entrances, avoiding cameras, avoiding questions, avoiding each other. The Prime Minister himself was conspicuously absent. Scheduled appearances were cancelled. Engagements quietly dropped. Official reasons cited urgent government business, but insiders told a different story. One described an office frozen in silence, phones ringing unanswered, aides pacing. Legal counsel consulted repeatedly. Decisions that normally took minutes now took hours, if they were made at all. Opposition parties sensed blood. Reform UK surged in visibility overnight. Membership numbers spiked as supporters rallied behind Farage, portraying him as the only figure willing to confront what they saw as systemic deception. Even critics acknowledged his control of the moment: calm, measured, relentless. While the government floundered, he looked composed, almost inevitable. Pollsters took notice. Flash surveys began circulating among party leadership. The numbers were brutal. Support collapsed in key demographics. Trust ratings plunged. Undecided voters moved sharply away from the government. For the first time in years, the possibility of a sudden election no longer seemed remote. It seemed plausible. The media tone shifted accordingly. Commentators stopped asking whether the Prime Minister could recover and started asking who would replace him. Former allies appeared on panels expressing disappointment. Legal experts debated potential consequences if evidence was authenticated. Constitutional scholars spoke openly about crisis scenarios usually reserved for textbooks, not nightly news. Behind the scenes, contingency plans accelerated. Civil servants were reportedly instructed to preserve documents related to migration policy, emails, messages, internal notes. The language used was telling. Do not delete. That instruction alone sent shock through Whitehall. It signalled that this was no longer just political damage control. It was preparation for inquiries, for resignations, for transition. As night fell, Westminster remained lit. Offices that usually emptied by evening buzzed late into the night. Corridors echoed with hurried footsteps. Boxes appeared outside offices. Staff whispered about scenarios and timelines. No one said collapse out loud, but everyone felt it looming. Outside, the crowds didn't disperse. If anything, they grew. And by the end of the day, one truth had become impossible to deny. Authority was slipping. Control was fading. And once a government loses both credibility and momentum at the same time, history shows that the ending rarely comes quietly. Britain wasn't just witnessing a scandal anymore, it was watching power drain away in real time. By the time morning approached, the atmosphere in Westminster had shifted from shock to inevitability. The question was no longer whether the Prime Minister had been weakened. That was already beyond dispute. The real question, now whispered through corridors and private offices, was far more dangerous. How long could this government continue to function at all? Senior figures spoke openly of an endgame, one that only days earlier would have seemed unthinkable. Behind closed doors, resignation letters were being drafted but not yet sent. Ministers waited, watching each other, calculating who would move first. No one wanted to be last. Loyalty had been replaced by survival. One senior source described the mood as every man for himself, a phrase that spread quickly through political circles as reality set in. The parliamentary arithmetic made the situation even more precarious. With backbench rebellion growing and trust collapsing, a motion of no confidence loomed like a guillotine. Whips worked through the night, calling MPS repeatedly, offering reassurances, positions, future favours, anything to stop the bleeding. But the responses were increasingly blunt. It's over. I can't defend this. My constituents won't forgive me. The discipline that once held the party together was disintegrating in real time. At the same time, legal pressure intensified. Senior barristers and former prosecutors weighed in publicly, warning that if the documents and recordings referenced in Parliament were authenticated, the consequences could extend far beyond resignation. Misconduct in public office, abuse of authority, obstruction, these weren't rhetorical threats. They were legal realities being discussed on primetime television. The gravity of that possibility hung heavily over Downing Street. International reaction added another layer of strain. Allies expressed concern through diplomatic channels. Markets continued to fluctuate as investors tried to assess whether Britain was heading toward paralysis. Analysts warned that prolonged uncertainty could damage confidence for years. The phrase leaderless government began appearing in foreign press reports, a devastating label for any country, let alone one already under economic pressure. Amid the turmoil, Nigel Farage remained disciplined and deliberate. He gave limited interviews, choosing his words carefully, refusing to overplay his hand. He framed his actions not as triumph, but as necessity. This is about truth, he repeated, about accountability. Whether one agreed with him or not, few could deny the impact. He had seized the narrative completely. Reform UK capitalised on the moment with stunning speed. Membership surged, donations flooded in. Local organisers reported record engagement. For the first time, the party was being spoken about not as a protest movement, but as a governing force. The political landscape was shifting under everyone's feet. Inside the Labour Party, the reckoning turned inward and vicious. Long simmering tensions erupted into open blame. Some accused leadership of arrogance. Others said warnings had been ignored for years. A few admitted they had known something was wrong, but stayed silent out of fear. Now, silence was no longer an option. As dawn broke over London, the symbolism was impossible to miss. Grey skies hung low over Westminster, mirroring the mood inside. MPS arrived early, avoiding cameras entering through side doors. Journalists waited in clusters, sensing history in the making. Security was tightened, barriers reinforced. Everyone understood that the day ahead could determine the fate of a government. Within Whitehall, contingency planning moved from theory to action. Officials discussed caretaker scenarios, departments prepared for leadership changes, civil servants trained to be neutral, quietly acknowledged the scale of the crisis. One senior official summed it up starkly. "We are preparing for a transition. This may not be survivable." Across the country, public anger had not cooled overnight. It had hardened. Call-in shows were flooded. Veterans groups announced marches. Charities reported surges in support accompanied by notes expressing fury at political priorities. The sense of betrayal cut deep, and it wasn't fading.